Hello and welcome. Glad to have you here. This is a great milestone. This is the 4th anniversary of this YouTube channel, Doug's Dharma. And what I want to do here is something a little bit unusual this year. I want to talk about the 5 best performing videos over the last 12 months, at least according to YouTube. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute. That's onlinedharma.org, where you can find courses, video courses about early Buddhism. And I'll leave a link down below. I'm going to run a sale for the next week until March 15th, I believe. I'll put the information down in a pinned comment below for as long as the sale is available. So you might want to take advantage of that if you're interested in learning a little bit more and taking a deeper dive into the kinds of material we discuss on this channel, which is, roughly speaking, early Buddhism from a contemporary perspective. What I want to do, as I say, is to talk about the 5 best performing videos over the last year, look at them, talk about them a little bit. But before I get there, I want to talk about 5 other videos that didn't make the top 5, but that I like and sort of think are worth bringing up again as sort of a look back over the last 12 months. And in case you want to see any of these videos, I'll leave links to all of them in the show notes down below. So if you missed one or want to see it again, it's right down there. You can just click on it down there. Now, I had roughly 80 videos over the last 12 months on this channel, so that's quite a lot of material here to go over. And it's hard for me to pick, favorites, but there are some that stood out to me as being, I think, the sorts of things that one might want to talk about a little bit. To begin with, a recent video that I think is one of my favorites is the video on Sariputta. A little sort of a mini history of Sariputta. He was the Buddha's chief disciple, and we often talk about Buddhism in terms of the Buddha himself, but I think there's reason to believe that Sariputta himself probably added a lot to the Dharma that we talk about today, and certainly seems to have been the impetus behind constructing, eventually, after the Buddha's lifetime, constructing the Abhidharma, which is a kind of a more philosophical structure of the Buddhist Dharma. Now, there also were a number of other videos that are sort of on more, I would say in a kind of a way, controversial topics of contemporary life, such as earlier video about whether BARBIE is becoming Buddhist. This is kind of fun to me because I got to look at some other videos on the BARBIE channel about meditation and how she, at least the people who were constructing this persona, did seem to have an interest in getting across some elements of mindfulness meditation, of breathing meditation. So it wasn't all bad, and indeed it has been described in a number of different places in the Buddhist community, contemporary community, in relatively positive terms. We also took a look at Maddie Weingast's new book, which is purported to be a translation of the Therigatha, which is a book of early poems by the first Buddhist women, considered to be the oldest anthology of women's literature in the world. And we asked the question when a translation is not a translation, because although this book claims to have been a translation, as we saw in the video, it actually wasn't a translation. It was more what I would say would be modern poetry written by Maddie Weingast in the spirit of these departed women. So that was a somewhat controversial one. After I came out with the video, in fact, I believe the same day, the publisher, Shambhala, released a statement saying that they were going to be withdrawing the book from publication in its current form and be reissuing it under new publication. We'll have to wait and see how that turns out, whether they're going to change the title, whether they're going to change the cover of the book, what is going to be different exactly. But at least it sounds at the outset like this might be a positive kind of result. Another somewhat controversial topic I did in the last year was Buddhism on suicide and euthanasia, which I believe was something like my number 4 performing video in the 24 hours after I published it. So it was relatively popular. Didn't quite crack the top 5 over the last year, but it was pretty popular. And this is a fraught topic, as I discuss in the video, because suicide and euthanasia are, in the main, thought of as being morally wrong within Buddhism. Certainly suicide is, and euthanasia is not really looked upon as any better an option within traditional Buddhism. However, if you look back at early Buddhism, if you look back at the suttas, you can find a number of places where the Buddha's viewpoint here seems somewhat more nuanced than we find nowadays. And not only does it seem more nuanced, but it seems that the Buddha's position was shocking and surprising to his close followers, as well as apparently to the commentarial community that seems to have had trouble with it as well, and I discuss all that in the video. Another one that I would recommend that came out over the last year was Buddhism on Race, which is caste in Buddhism, basically. There isn't really a notion of race in early Buddhism, which is what I'm looking at, the Pali texts in particular. There isn't really any discussion of race per se, because race is really a modern concept. However, there's a lot of discussion of caste, and the way that the Buddha was opposed to the caste system of his day. This notion that there are different strata to society that are organized in order and that are based upon purity of birth. This was something that was believed by certain people in his day, and indeed is believed even nowadays in India. And so I discussed that topic, looking at race through the lens of the Buddha's views on caste. And I think that's the kind of thing that makes sense even nowadays for us to reflect back upon when we think of issues, let's say, of social justice and so on. Now, having said that, let's turn to our top 5. The ones I've just been discussing are some of the ones that I think are worth bringing up again. They weren't in the top 5, but I think they're worth seeing. And there are other ones as well, but I have to pick a few. I don't want to go on too long. So the top 5, now, how am I picking these? YouTube allows us to see top 5 over various time periods in the last year or whatever, however long you pick. And they'll say, do you want to see the top videos by 24 hours, by 1 week, and by 28 days? And 28 days is their longest amount. And using this technique from YouTube that YouTube gives us allows us to compare these on an apples-to-apples basis. In other words, I could look back on the last year and see which ones got the most views, which ones of my videos got the most views, but this isn't going to be apples to apples because obviously some were released quite a long time ago, almost a year ago, let's say, whereas others were released quite recently. So you're comparing apples to oranges. Whereas this way we're looking at the first 28 days after publication. So on those terms, the number 5 was Buddhism's decline in India. And this was the video over the last year, one of the videos over the last year that took me the longest time to do research for, because I had to read a number of actual recent books, papers. This is a topic of controversy within the larger Buddhist community. I think there's, as I mentioned in the video, there's been a long, even centuries, perhaps even millennia-long discussion about this, not quite a millennium, but it's a long ways, blaming one particular kind of thing, the rise of Islam in particular, the descent of Islam into the Indian subcontinent, that was what was responsible here. And recent scholarship, as found in a number of different books and papers, has pushed back on that, has found that the case is much more complicated, that indeed Islam did play a role, but it was relatively minor in the whole scheme of things. Now this annoys some people. This is something that some people find difficult to accept. A lot of people are very invested in a very, I would say, simplistic kind of story here. But I think it's best to look at these things in their nuances, both because it's more historically accurate and because it can give us a little bit more room away from seeing people as, good and evil. because seeing people as good and evil is the sort of thing that promotes hatred, promotes backlashes. It's not healthy for us. It's much healthier for us to begin to understand the nuances. The number 4 video over the last 28 days was about jhana, this state of deep meditative absorption. And the video was about how deep jhana gets. Essentially, there has been a recent discussion in Buddhism about, or I should say a recent sort of, I wouldn't say, well, debate or controversy, we might even say minor controversy, over how deep these meditative absorptions are supposed to be, because we have people on both sides. People saying that indeed the meditative absorptions were originally very, very deep, and it took a long time, a lot of practice to get into them, that once we were in those states, we were very much isolated from the world, and so they're not the sorts of things that we can achieve easily and simply. On the other hand, we have people saying that no, in fact, if you look at the early texts, you'll find that they're not actually quite so deep as all that, and they don't take so much effort and time and practice to attain. And there's been a back and forth between these people over the recent years, especially because jhana practice has become more popular over the last, I would say, decade or two, maybe 2 decades. Before that, it was sort of looked upon as something that was completely unnecessary, because in the insight community in the West, which comes from Lady Sayadaw's views in Burma at the turn of the last century, or I should say at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, around that time frame, it was demoted. It was felt that jhana was not necessary. While people nowadays still think that jhana is not, well, there's differences of opinion about that. That's a different video, but in any event, whether or not we feel jhana is necessary, many people now feel that jhana is at least useful, and the question is how much effort does it take to achieve? The number 3 video over the last year, number 3 video over the first 28 days of release, was a video called The Buddha Had His Limits. And this, and there's also another video which, although it's not quite as popular as these, is on a similar topic and also was very popular, about when words don't work, about self-defense in early Buddhism. These are 2 related videos that came out either right after each other or very close to each other, because I was working on the same topic at the same time. And I think this issue of the Buddha having his limits is something that resonates with a lot of people, because we know that Buddhism is especially early Buddhism, is a very pacifist kind of viewpoint, religion or philosophy. It's one that basically never recommends violence. So then the question is, what should we do? Are we supposed to, allow people to walk all over us? And a lot of people find that possibility to be very disconcerting and even unhealthy. And so I think for a lot of people, they're curious, perhaps you are as well, curious about what the Buddha would have had to say about this. Okay, so if we aren't going to let ourselves be walked all over, then how do we push back? And what role does the Buddha play in giving us a kind of a model for what to do under these circumstances? And so this video about the Buddha having his limits is where I discuss that. The number 2 video over the last year is a video on Buddhism icons, from prohibition to idolatry. And a lot of this material came from a recent book, which by Robert D. Caroli, I believe is his name, Image Problems, where he discusses this very issue, basically, the role of imagery, of icons within Buddhism and the history of Buddhism and how it developed. And I found that book very, very interesting, and because it reveals a kind of I want to almost say an ironic kind of history, because Buddhism began with a very nearly a nearly prohibiting icons, nearly prohibiting the use of images of the Buddha in particular, because the Buddha was looked upon as somebody who had passed away. And so didn't exist anymore. And so, as a result, in a sense, was beyond being depicted in imagery. However, that changed. This view of imagery changed in the early centuries of the Common Era. And obviously, as we know, imagery became more and more popular in Buddhism, including imagery of the Buddha himself. And it got to the point many, many, many centuries later where when Buddhism interacted with the West, many Western visitors to Asia at the time viewed Buddhism as basically not only a religion that used images, but as sort of the paradigmatic idolatrous religion. I mean, they were sort of, Buddhists were seen as, sort of the way idolaters are supposed to be, these people who only worship images. Of course, these opinions of these early Western visitors were wildly off the mark, as tends to happen when you have these kinds of encounters between very different cultures, especially early encounters where they don't know each other very well. There's just an enormous scope for misinterpretation. Nevertheless, the history is quite interesting, and so that's what I try to get to in the video, and it seems to have been of interest because I think a lot of you are interested in Buddhist imagery, as am I, frankly. I've got some right behind me, as it happens. Finally, my most popular video over the last 12 months, was, drumroll please, how to become a Buddhist. Now, I knew that this was going to be somewhat popular when I did the video, because I know that people are interested in Buddhism in general, and in particular in kind of introductions to Buddhism. Those tend to be my most popular videos are these very, very introductory ones. And it's one of my most popular questions over the years, has been, oh, I'm interested in Buddhism, how do I become a Buddhist? And so a short video with that title and that subject is, doesn't surprise me that becomes popular. To my own way of thinking, it's also a little bit ironic, just because for myself, I think becoming Buddhist isn't really so important. I think what's more important is to learn the Buddhist Dharma, to practice Buddhism, to begin to understand the world in terms of the concepts of Buddhism, in particular that it's always changing, that it's non-self, that it's unsatisfactory in some sense, these kinds of things. They're much more important than putting a label on ourselves. However, lots of people do indeed find it comforting to have that label. This is a form of self-identity or clinging to a kind of an identity of ourselves as Buddhist in this particular case. So in any way, I also had another video after that where I talk about whether it's really necessary to become a Buddhist, but oddly that one isn't as popular as this one. Which again, doesn't entirely surprise me, because this is the more clear kind of idea, how to become a Buddhist. If you're interested in that subject or just want to see the most popular video over the last 12 months, I'll put a link to it up here on the screen and you can take a look. Thanks so much. If you're getting something out of these videos, do take a look at my Patreon page. It's linked down below, and help us out and get something in return as well. We'll catch you on the next one.